Hi, I'm James. Welcome back to another chapter of Action and Adventure Tips, the YouTube channel dedicated to those of you who want to create content but aren't quite sure how to do it or get it right. My goal here is to help you get it right, so you don't look like an idiot, get that 1-star review, and get hammered by people who know what they're talking about. Today's topic, handguns. Now, what is a handgun? Is a rifle a handgun? No, it's not. A handgun is simply a firearm you can hold in one hand. Now, there are several different types. We call them pistols, but we also break those down into either revolvers or semi-automatics, or as they're sometimes called, automatics, erroneously. Or you can even have a bolt-action handgun or a break-action handgun, and yes, they do exist. Those are mainly for hunting or for competition, so we're not going to cover it here today. Instead, today's topic is on the revolver and the semi-automatic pistol. Now, there are two basic types, two basic types of revolvers. There's either the single action or the double action. And as you know from last week, the Glock is a semi-automatic pistol. And that's the type of pistols you have, usually semi-automatic. Although, believe it or not, there are automatic pistols. As a matter of fact, the Glock 18 is an automatic pistol where you pull the trigger once and it basically does a mag dump. It empties however many rounds are held in that magazine. Is that legal for civilians in the US? No, and I'll explain why in another chapter later on. But today we're just going to cover revolvers and semi-automatic pistols. Now, the first type of revolver is the one we know of as the single action revolver. You may be familiar with this one, watching the old John Wayne movies or something like that. The thing about the single action revolver is that it can't fire just by pulling on the trigger. And I'll show you. Here it is. This is the hammer. It should come back, right? Okay. I'm squeezing on the trigger. What am I doing? Also making sure that the firearm is pointed in a safe direction. Why do I know it's safe? Because I just looked down there. Do I know this is empty? Yes, I've actually done a check prior to doing it. And you can tell by doing this, you can see there's nothing right there. Now, the way a revolver works is typically the hammer is pulled back, and as you can see, the cylinder right here actually revolves, hence the term revolver. When you pull on the trigger, the hammer will come forward and strike a firing pin. The firing pin is what actually hits the primer in the cartridge. That starts the whole little mini explosion inside the handgun to send the bullet out the barrel towards its hopefully intended target. Now, inside here is actually a spring that is what helps A, cock the firearm, and B, revolve the cylinder. This cylinder doesn't pop out. As a matter of fact, the only way you could actually check this cylinder is by looking through what's called the loading gate right here. This little thing. That should have been shut when we were actually doing that, but hey, it wasn't. And this is how you actually load it, one round at a time. You have to revolve the cylinder or continue rotating it and putting rounds inside the cylinder. And to pop those fired rounds out, you actually have to use what we call the extractor rod. And this one is right here. I don't know if you can see it right there, but as you can see, I'm pushing it. And as I'm pushing it, it is going through the cylinder and it'll pop out around. Now, this firearm, this revolver, is actually in what we call the half-cocked position, which means that it's neither ready to fire and you can't pull the trigger back to actually fire it. To do that, you actually have to pull it all the way back and then squeeze the trigger. So when you hear the expression half-cocked, that's what it means. Not quite ready to go off, but close to it. Almost ready. So keeping that in mind, you want to talk about that. Okay, so this hammer right here, as you can see, does not have a firing pin on it. A firing pin would be basically a little pin that sticks out that strikes the actual primer in the cartridge. Instead, this has got what is called an internal firing pin. So the hammer, this part right there, will hit that firing pin and drive it forward. Some revolvers actually have the firing pin on them. And a good way to stop somebody from shooting a revolver is to stick the hand of your web right there and look, they can't shoot now all of a sudden because the web of your hand is stuck. Wham, just like that. So if you're going to write about stopping somebody from shooting a firearm, that's the way to do it. You don't put your finger in the barrel because you get your finger blown off, and you don't grab the cylinder because even if you do grab the cylinder, you can still fire it. So the only way to prevent somebody from shooting is to actually put your hand in that web. Put your web of your hand between the barrel, the cylinder, and the hammer, between the hammer and the firing pin. All right. That's your typical single action revolver. This little part here is called the loading gate. Just keep that in mind. I believe that on Colts, they're on the opposite side, which gives me to believe that the person who invented it, Samuel Colt, was actually left-handed because it's easier to load that way, possibly. Yeah, I think he was left-handed because this is like this. I'm not sure exactly. We can research it. That's what research is about, isn't it? Okay, I have here what is called a double action revolver. Once again, it's empty. You can see there's nothing in the cylinder. The difference between a double action and a single action is that with the double action, when you squeeze the trigger, the hammer will actually come back and the cylinder will revolve inside the frame. This is the frame, by the way. The barrel is attached to the frame. So, how do you open this and reload it? Well, typically, there's a little button right here, which you can either push in, push forward, or pull back, depending on the type of firearm. A Colt is a pull back, a Smith & Wesson is a push forward. This is a Ruger, it's a push, and you push the cylinder out like that. Now, when I was a police officer, this is something very similar to what I carried, which was actually a Smith & Wesson Model 19, which was 38 Special. So to reload these, you would release the button, push the cylinder out with your hand like that, turn the gun this way, and slam the ejection rod. The whole purpose there is you want those rounds pushed out as rapidly as you could. Reach down to your duty belt, use what is called a speed loader. I actually started out with strips. Drop the bullets in there, throw the speed loader behind you, close the cylinder, and you're ready to fire again. So that is a basic double action. Once again, you can see that there is no firing pin, so the internal spring is what drives the revolutions of the cylinder and the actual hammer. So the firing pin here is internal. Once again, just put your hand like that. Whoa, hey, look, you can't fire it. So if you're going to write about firing, stopping somebody from shooting, once again, you don't grab the barrel, you don't grab the cylinder. You actually have to put a body part between the hammer and the frame and the firing pin. Alrighty. So that is your basic revolver. The type that you're most commonly going to experience is the double action revolver that you're writing about, unless of course you're writing Westerns, and then you have to get into the whole percussion pistols, which operate on a very similar principle. The difference is reloading is considerably different. They used to basically pop the cylinders out and throw a new cylinder in, mainly because it took too long to actually load the powder and ball. So that's the difference between a percussion cap and a modern firearm, is the fact that we just use full cartridges now. And we're going to get into cartridges in another channel or another video. But for today, let's focus on the pistols. Alrighty. Now, semi-automatic pistols. There are a couple of different types. This is one of them, but they all operate under the principle, generally speaking, of what we call blowback, where the gases or the recoil from the actual firearm going out. Remember, every force has an opposite and equal reaction. Well, when that bullet goes out, it drives the slide backwards. In this case, this is a little Ruger. It has a very little tiny slide. Why? Because it's a 22 caliber. And as you can see, this is also empty. And this is not going to fire while the slide is back. This is a very important thing. Nor is it going to go click, click, click when the slide is back, because it can't. And that's because the firing pin is internal in the slide itself. So to fire this, you have to release the slide. Make sure that in this case, the safety is on. You can see I'll try and pull the trigger back. Nothing. Safety is off. Once again, safe, yes, squeeze, and it will fire. And once it fires, it will come back again, like that. Now, most firearms are fed with what is called a magazine. And trust me, we're going to have a good little discussion on magazines versus clips in the next video. But this is a magazine. A magazine is actually what holds the ammunition. And as you put more ammunition in it, it's pushed down and held in place by this little lip up here. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. And as you fire, the ammunition goes up and up and up. The spring actually pushes the ammunition up. The round is fired. It is ejected from the firearm, the handgun. The magazine pushes another round up. the slide comes forward, pushes that cartridge into the barrel or the chamber of the barrel, and you're ready to fire again. So to do that, you just insert it and you're ready to go. By the way, this magazine is empty. And there you have it, another empty firearm. So that's one type of automatic. The other type of semi-automatic is something like the Glock. As you saw from the last video, this is a Glock 23. Oh, look, there's the safety right there. Will this fire in this position? No. And this is the position it's going to wind up in when it empties the magazine. See? Nothing. It's not sliding forward. So keep that in mind. So the first thing about semi-automatics is they all have a magazine, and some of them you can actually see how many rounds are in it by looking at it. Little dots on the back here indicate there are 13 rounds in this magazine. Some will actually have a transparent side so you can look easily, although I have to admit I have never fired a firearm, and I've fired a lot of them, and looked at the magazine to see how many rounds I had left. And the reason being is that I typically will actually count my rounds as I'm shooting. That was hammered into me in law enforcement academies. So this kind of firearm, just pretty much every semi-automatic is going to be composed of two basic parts. The upper part called the slide and the lower part called the receiver. So let's, once again, empty, squeeze, nothing happens. In this case, we're going to remove the slide. As you can see, here's the receiver. The magazine is fed up into the magazine well until it catches. Once again, you can see that like that. To drop it, you push the magazine release button. You got your trigger. This is called a trigger guard. We'll get into all this stuff later on. And this is the slide. This is the actual part where the actual bullet is fired from. And what's happening is that this has what is called a striker instead of a firing pin. Now, some semi-automatics, like the 1911, have an external hammer with an internal firing pin. Some semi-automatics, like the Glock, do not have an external hammer. It's all internal. And actually, there is no hammer because what you have is what is called a striker. And the striker is very similar to a firing pin, but the difference is that rather than having the hammer hit the firing pin and everything originally being initiated by the spring in the grip, in this case, the spring is actually inside here, inside the slide, and it abuts the striker. And when the slide is racked back, the spring has all the tension on it. You pull the trigger, the tension is released, the spring slides forward, or springs forward, hits the striker, which in turn hits the primer of the cartridge. That initiates the mini explosion inside your handgun. Alrighty. So that is the basic differences between the different types of firearms, between the semi-automatic and the revolver. And on top of that, as I mentioned, this is a handgun. It's also called a firearm. A rifle is not a handgun. Why? Because a handgun is something that is held in one hand, typically with a short barrel, and you can fire it with one hand. A rifle is called a long arm because it typically requires two hands to hold it, and you typically will put the stock on your shoulder. So that's it for today's tips. Just remember, they're all pistols, they're all handguns. It's just we break them down between revolvers and semi-automatics. And in the revolvers, you have the single action and the double action. So click like, hit the subscribe button, and check out my webpage, jamespeet.com, if you'd like to learn more. Stay safe out there.